For a bit of context, this actually happened to a teacher who used to do babysitting when she was about maybe in her late 20s at the time. Now, this was back in the late 90s, so my teacher at the time was only engaged to her husband, and this was sometime around the late 90s. She did start as a teacher at a job back in 2001, but she was still job hunting at the time. With her other work and that keeping her at bay with a lot of stuff, she thought she needed a different source of income to help pay for certain things. Sure, her fiance worked more, but they started to get a little bit behind on bills and rent. So this case, the teacher at the time of this story, we will call her Kat. Kat basically did babysitting for at least a couple kids. Most of them were from newborns to at least 9 or 10. Some people may argue as 9 or 10 to be too old for a babysitter, but that was just how it was for some people. Now, Kat did babysit this one girl who was about 7, named Jessica. Jessica was 7 at the time, so Kat and Jessica not lived too far from each other, as Kat only lived about a few minutes away from where Jessica was. Now, she walked there as she didn't have a problem with walking, but however, though, when she started talking to Kat about things, Jessica actually learned that Kat was actually a pretty nice lady. Now, oftentimes, Kat would babysit Jessica at least a few times a week due to her parents going to work and etc. Of course, Kat didn't mind the extra long hours, whereas as it meant double pay, so it was pretty decent at the time. However, when Kat was babysitting Jessica one night, however, this night was something that really shook them both. Now, this was sometime late at night when Kat and Jessica were watching TV around when it seemed to be lights out. Now, keep in mind that Jessica was allowed to stay up till around 9:30, so she was just basically watching some kids shows after she was all ready for bed. Kat was watching it with her when all of a sudden she heard what seemed to be a door creaking. Now, normally she thought that maybe it might have been the closet door, but there was no one in the house besides her. And her parents weren't supposed to be home till around midnight, so Kat stayed for a little bit. However, though, there was something really odd when the creaking happened and asked if Jessica was the one who moved and made the creaking noises. But Jessica said that she didn't, and she was just watching TV. Didn't hear any creaking. At first, Kat thought it might have been maybe the show she was watching. I believe the show was Bananas Pajamas, so Jessica just continued watching her show. However, though, Kat got up and ended up hearing what seemed to be someone laughing. It sounded like as if someone was laughing hysterically. Kat ended up flipping on the lights, but couldn't really find any source of anyone, and looked in every door. Of course, Kat couldn't find anyone as she searched the whole place, but found no one in the house. Now, she decided she would call the cops if she were to see someone in the house, but decided to put Jessica to bed. After Jessica had went to bed, Kat continued to watch TV, which happened to be one of the talk show reruns. As she was watching one of those, she ended up hearing that mechanical, almost manic laughter. This honestly got Kat to look up, but couldn't see anyone or hear any source of where the noise was coming from. This was getting really strange, so Kat ended up phoning the neighbors to see if one of them, who happened to be a retired cop, can come and search the house to make sure there really wasn't anyone in there. Now, called Kat paranoid, but the officer, retired one, searched around the house, but couldn't find anyone in the room. This honestly really bothers Kat a bit when she babysat Jessica a couple more times. Whatever that laugh or whatever was pretty much Whatever that mechanical laughter was pretty much completely paranormal. Unfortunately, Kat never found out if there was someone in their house or if it was paranormal. But unfortunately, that was never confirmed. So this happened sometime, I guess, in 2003 when a friend of mine happened to be about 8 years old at the time. Now, at this time, we will call her at the time of this story named Isabella. Isabella was about 8 years old at the time of the story when she was still being babysat by a really nice lady. She happened to be a high school student that went to college, but babysat Isabella when he was off of college. Now, this was at the time when her babysitter came over after college, so this happened back in 2003. Jessica was her name, and she was the really great babysitter that Isabella ever had. Most of the nights they would do some very fun stuff like watching TV, order pizza, get to stay up a little bit on weekends, etc. However, though, something really weird happened around sometime after New Year's. So, after New Year's at the time, Isabella was being babysat by Jessica again, since pretty much her mother, who was a single mom, happened to be working 2 jobs and had to take double time since one of the workers had called in sick. Now, at the time of the story, Isabella had no idea where her dad was another story, but they just said that her parents had separated when Isabella was only about 5 or 6 years old due to some family personal reasons that she would not want it to be out there. However, though, at the time of this story, Jessica was working a different job in the morning, but happened to be able to take the babysitting job. However, this was just around the time when a neighbor just moved into a house that lived right next door to Isabella's house. Now, he seemed pretty okay, although he seemed a bit sketchy. He happened to be in his 40s and happened to have his window wide open. What I mean by that is he would have the curtains open all the way so he could see through what's going on at the next door neighbors. Now, at first they thought this was kind of sketchy, but eventually Isabella's parents or her mother thought that maybe he was just looking for something to do. Now, when Jessica came over to babysit Isabella, it would happen to be on a weekday, which happened to be on Wednesday, and since Isabella had school the next day, she had to be in bed. However, though, this was one night that really freaked the both of them out, mostly Isabella. Isabella was getting ready for bed when she looked over to see that same next door neighbor who was staring at her from his window. Honestly, Isabella thought it was quite creepy that this man was obviously staring at her. However, she ended up telling Jessica that someone was staring at her in her window. Eventually, the man was gone, so Jessica thought that maybe it was just something else, or maybe he must have went to bed. However, the light was still somewhat on, so that was a really major red flag there. However, about maybe around 10 o'clock at night, Isabella got up to use the bathroom when she looked to see that the man was staring right at her. He didn't seem to recognize, but he seemed to see that there was definitely something not right about this man. Of course, Isabella told her babysitter Jessica about this, so Jessica went over and talked to the neighbor about it, which she happened to tell him to stop and to leave Isabella alone. Isabella had her curtains closed at the time, but however, this man seemed to be arguing with the babysitter for about a good 10 minutes before he slammed the door right in her face. Not wanting to argue, Jessica ended up going back in the house to wait for Isabella's mother. Now, it was around the time when there was a really bad snowstorm, so Isabella's mother said that she was going to be a little longer than usual to get home. However, as Jessica was doing her homework for college, she ended up looking over to see that there was a loud banging coming from the door. It happened to be the same man from next door, and he somehow had a large knife and started screaming profanities. Fortunately, Jessica happened to lock the door, but of course, this man started breaking it down as much as he could, but as soon as he didn't break it down, he ended up going to the backyard to try to break in. Now, Jessica ended up calling the police and ended up running upstairs and locking herself in the same room with Isabella. Isabella's mother's room was the only room that had the lock. When Isabella was awoken by Jessica, she was honestly confused as to what was going on, but Jessica told her that man somehow was trying to break into her house. Not wanting to scare the 8-year-old, she didn't want to lie. After the cops had arrived, they didn't find the man who tried to break in the house, but Jessica ended up explaining that he lived next door and was staring at Isabella from his bedroom. Of course, the cops went over there and told him everything, and he was eventually arrested. Now, Isabella's mother came home when the cops were there, and the cops were talking to her for at least a good 20 minutes about it, and it turns out that this next door neighbor happened to be somewhat of a child predator. He had a history of really messed up stuff that he did in the past, and there was some evidence of it when they searched over his house. He was sentenced to jail, and that's when Isabella and her mother moved at least a month later. They honestly couldn't handle the constant paranoia of this man or whatever, but they're sure glad that Jessica called the cops. If Jessica had not called the cops about this man, who knows what could have happened that night. Now, one of my friends that happened to live in Utah does not really remember this story. Now, his name was Darren, and he happened to be about maybe in his early teens and started working as a babysitter. Now, I believe this was sometime when he was about maybe 14 years old in 2012. And back when he was living in Utah, he was babysitting some kids to make a little extra cash on the side. Now, at the time of this story, he babysat one young man who happened to be about 3 years old. Now, this boy's name was Benny, and he was one of those really challenging babies. Not really babies, but basically 3-year-old toddlers, so to speak. Now, Benny had Down syndrome and he was autistic, so he did have, some outbursts where he didn't like certain things. Needless to say, it was a bit of a pain in the ass, but despite that, it didn't seem to be really of a bad idea of babysitting, as Darren really enjoyed it. Some kids he babysat were behaved, while others were challenges, but he still managed to pull it through. However, though, something really strange started to go on. Now, however, I will get to the main thing. Now, Darren, however, happened to be babysitting Benny, and he was staying at least a few nights, as his parents happened to be going on vacation for about a few days to California. So Darren was looking after Benny at the time. However, it was about 1 a.m. when Darren woke up to hear what seemed to be like a door opening and closing. However, Darren ends up going downstairs to see that there was a man with a large crowbar. How he got into the house is something Darren had no idea, but he seemed to be going through some stuff when Darren grabbed his crowbar, who happened to know from his dad, who being ex-military, he knew how to take weapons off of people. As soon as Darren took the crowbar, the man immediately turned around and ended up getting hit in the head hard, being knocked out with the crowbar. As Darren can't remember much of what happened, but all he do remember was he called the cops and the police arrested him. He does not know what happened since then, but Benny did not even wake up. This was honestly shocking, but what could have happened if Darren had not woken up to this guy walking into his house, or the house that he was babysitting at? That still confuses him, but since he does not remember much about it, I think it's just good to say that no one was murdered that night.